The morning light always reached the diner before anyone else did. It crept through the wide front windows, brushed against the metal counter, and made the silver napkin holders shine softly. The place didn't look special from the outside, but inside it held a certain warmth. It was the kind of diner where people came not because they expected something new, but because they knew exactly what they would get: a hot meal, a quick refill of coffee, and a quiet corner to rest for a few minutes before life carried them back outside, among all the sounds that filled the diner, the hum of the coffee machine, the soft scrape of plates, the low chatter of early customers. There was always one sound that never seemed to rise: the voice of the young waitress who moved through the aisles each morning. She walked with care, carrying plates with both hands, her steps light on the tiled floor. Most people barely noticed her, and even when they did, they remembered the food more than the person who brought it. She didn't stand out in any dramatic way. She wasn't loud, she wasn't talkative, she didn't try to entertain customers or join conversations at tables. She simply worked quietly, steadily, as if trying not to disturb anyone. People often described her as shy, though few ever took the time to know if that was truly the case. She kept her hair tied back in a simple style, wore her apron neatly, and made sure each table was set the same way every morning. Small details mattered to her, even when other people didn't seem to care. Her shift started early, long before the morning rush. She would arrive while the sun was still deciding whether to rise fully or hide behind the buildings. She would push open the back door, clock in, and step into the warm smell of fresh bread and sizzling bacon. The cook on the morning shift always nodded at her, and she nodded back. They didn't exchange many words, but there was a quiet understanding between them. He worked in the kitchen. She worked in the aisles. They shared the silence in their own way. Once her apron was tied and her notepad was tucked into her pocket, she moved to the front of the diner to wipe the tables. She liked this part of the morning most. There was something peaceful about preparing the place before the noise and movement filled it again. She wiped carefully, often cleaning the same surface twice without realizing it. The steady motion calmed her mind. In the far corner of the diner, near the windows, stood an old upright piano. It had been placed there just a few months earlier by the owner, who thought it would give the diner a classic look. But the piano did not shine like it once did. It sat there, slightly scratched, with keys that no longer matched in color. Still, it had a charm that somehow suited the diner perfectly. Most people ignored it, thinking it was just decoration, but she DIDN single quotes T every morning. After wiping down the tables, she would pause near the piano. Her hand would drift over the wooden top, brushing away the thin layer of dust that always settled there overnight. She never played it, at least not while anyone was watching. She simply looked at it for a few seconds, then went back to work. She once knew how to play beautifully, in fact, but life had a strange way of twisting dreams into something else. Years ago, she played the piano every day. She learned songs by ear and practiced until her fingers were sore. Music filled her house the way sunlight filled the diner each morning. She didn't think she would ever stop. But when things changed at home and responsibilities grew heavier, she had to leave the piano behind. She didn't abandon it on purpose. It happened slowly. One missed day became a week, then a month. Soon, touching the keys felt like touching a memory she wasn't ready to relive. So she kept her distance. She didn't mention her past to anyone. She didn't talk about music or talent or dreams she once held. She focused on her work, on the plates she carried, on the tables she served. And everyone around her accepted the version of her they saw, a quiet waitress with gentle manners and a soft smile. On most days, customers came, and went without learning her name. They were lost in their own lives, rushing to work, dealing with problems, making phone calls, juggling schedules. Some were polite, offering a thank you or a nod. Others barely lifted their eyes from their screens. She didn't take it personally. She understood people were busy, and she never expected special attention. But being invisible day after day has a way of affecting a person. She wouldn't describe herself as lonely, but she often felt like a shadow in her own workplace, blending into the motion around her. She tried to stay focused on the good moments, the rare customer who made friendly conversation, the warm smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven, or the peaceful minutes before the diner opened. Those small things kept her grounded. As the morning shifted into midday, the diner slowly filled. The regulars took their usual spots. The owner walked in and checked on everything. The sound of forks and spoons grew louder. But through it all, she continued her steady routine. She was always there when someone needed a refill, always nearby when a plate needed clearing. Her timing, though unnoticed by many, was almost perfect. Despite how quietly she moved, she had a kind heart that showed in subtle ways. When an elderly customer struggled to pick up a dropped napkin, she bent quickly to help him. When a mother with a fussy toddler came in, she brought the child an extra spoon to play with. When someone spilled water, she cleaned it without complaint. People rarely thanked her more than once, but she never expected more than that. Still, the piano remained in the back of her thoughts. Every time she passed it, a small ache hit her, not painful, just a soft reminder of something she once loved deeply. She wondered sometimes if she still remembered how to play. Her fingers still twitched when she heard a melody somewhere in the background, as if they were trying to reach for keys that weren't there. One day, during a quiet moment in the late morning, she found herself standing in front of the piano again. She looked around. No one was paying attention. The cook was busy in the back. The customers were wrapped up in their meals and conversations. With a soft breath, she reached out and pressed a single key. The sound was a little dull, a little dusty, but somehow still warm. She pressed another one. The notes didn't match, and it made her smile faintly. She pulled her hand away and went back to work before anyone noticed. That tiny moment stayed with her the rest of the day. It wasn't much, just two soft notes, but for her, it meant something. It felt like the beginning of a small ripple inside her, something light and familiar stirring again. As the day moved on, she tried to push the thought aside, but she couldn't stop remembering how the keys felt beneath her fingers. Her mind drifted back to childhood moments she had tucked away long ago. She remembered the way her old piano sat by the window at home, the way the sunlight hit the keys, the way she used to hum while playing. She remembered the pride on her mother's face when she learned a new song. She remembered the simple joy of creating something beautiful, even when the world felt uncertain. In the diner, though, she kept her hands busy with work. She cleared plates, refilled drinks, and greeted new customers. She stayed patient even when some were short-tempered or distracted. She didn't know that anyone noticed her patience, but the cook did. He had worked in restaurants long enough to see the difference between someone who cared about their job and someone who simply had to be there. He didn't mention it to her. He wasn't the type to talk much, but he appreciated her reliability. By evening, the diner slowed down. The sky outside turned soft with fading light. The after-work crowd trickled in, some ordering takeout, others lingering at their tables. She moved through it all, still quiet, still steady. At the end of her shift, she untied her apron and hung it on the hook in the back. She smiled politely at the cook before heading out the back door. The walk home was always peaceful. She liked the cool air and the way the streetlights stretched across the sidewalk. She didn't live far, just a few blocks away. On most nights, her mind was tired from the long hours, But this time, her thoughts were full. She kept thinking about that small moment earlier when she pressed the piano keys. She tried to remember the exact sound. She tried to imagine what it would feel like to play a full song again, to let her hands move the way they once did. But as she reached her small apartment, she shook her head gently. Life now was different. She had responsibilities, bills to pay, things to manage. Music was a luxury she didn't think she could afford anymore, not just in money, but in time and emotional space. So she pushed the thought aside again, the same way she had many times before. Still, she couldn't fully forget it. Over the next few days, she continued her routine: early mornings, busy rushes, quiet evenings. But something inside her had shifted slightly. Every time she walked past the piano, she looked at it a little longer. She touched the keys a little more often, even if only for a moment. She didn't play anything yet, not a real melody, but the small sounds she made brought something warm into her day. The diner stayed the same, with customers who came and went, unaware of the small story unfolding right in front of them. Number one knew that the quiet waitress who served their meals had a hidden gift. No one knew that the old piano in the corner had once been a doorway to a dream she never spoke about. No one paid attention to the soft glances she gave the instrument. But sometimes the biggest changes begin quietly, almost invisibly. They start with the old piano in the corner had always blended into the diner like any other piece of furniture. People walked past it, placed their bags beside it, leaned their jackets over its edges, and sometimes rested their elbows on it while waiting for their food. To most customers, it was just something the owner thought would make the place feel classic, even if no one touched it. But in the quiet waitress's world, the piano stood out more than anything else. It tugged at her attention every single day. Her routine hadn't changed. She still came early, still wiped tables, still worked with calm patience. But ever since she pressed those two dusty keys, a feeling she thought she had buried long ago kept rising again. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was gentle, like a soft tap on a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. It followed her from table to table. It stayed with her during slow hours when she stood near the counter, waiting for the next customer. It grew stronger every time she walked near the corner where the piano sat. She didn't tell anyone about the feeling. She didn't think anyone would understand. The diner was not the kind of place where workers talked deeply about their past dreams. People came to work, did their jobs, joked lightly when there was time, and left when their shifts were over. Everyone had bills. Everyone had responsibilities. Everyone had some part of their life they didn't talk about, and she assumed hers was no different. But inside, something was waking up. One late morning, after the breakfast rush had quieted down, she found herself standing near the piano again. The diner hummed softly. A couple sat by the window, speaking in low voices. A man near the counter scrolled on his phone, tapping the screen with tired eyes. The cook clattered pans in the kitchen, preparing for the lunch crowd. She glanced around before extending her hand. Her fingers brushed the keys lightly. She didn't press them down, just let her fingertips glide over them. The familiar coolness of the keys sent a small flicker through her chest. It felt like greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She pulled her hand back when the kitchen door swung open. The cook stepped outside, wiping his hands on a towel, and she quickly turned toward the tables, pretending to adjust salt shakers. He didn't notice anything unusual, but her heart beat faster anyway. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but it still felt strange to be so drawn to something she didn't dare touch in front of others. The lunch rush rolled in, pulling her into the usual rhythm of back-and-forth orders, refills, checks, and quick footsteps. She moved through it all smoothly, but her mind drifted back to the piano in every spare second. She didn't understand why it bothered her so much. She thought she had accepted a life without music. She thought working, earning, and keeping to herself were enough. For the most part, they were. But something about that piano's quiet presence made her wonder if she had let go too soon. If she had convinced herself she didn't need something she actually did that day. Near closing time, something unexpected happened. A family came into the diner, the kind with small kids who loved to explore everything they saw. The adults sat at a booth while their 2 children wandered curiously, their hands touching menus, chairs, napkins, anything that wasn't nailed down. She brought their drinks and placed them on the table while keeping an eye on the younger child, who had stopped in front of the piano. The little girl reached up and tapped one of the keys. A bright, uneven note echoed through the diner. The girl giggled and pressed another key, then another. The sound was jumbled, loud, and completely without rhythm. A few customers turned their heads, but didn't look bothered. The waitress felt a strange pull in her chest again. The sound was messy, but it reminded her of a time when she herself sat at a piano for the first time, too short to reach the pedals, too small to understand how to play properly. She had tapped random notes too, until someone taught her how to make them form something beautiful. After a moment, the parents called the children back, apologizing to her with tired smiles. She shook her head gently to show it was fine. She had heard far worse in the diner. Those random notes didn't bother her at all. In fact, they left her with a restless feeling she couldn't shake off. That night, after she clocked out, she lingered for a moment near the corner. The lights were dimming as the owner got ready to lock up. She hesitated, almost reaching toward the piano again, but pulled her hand away and turned toward the door. The owner thanked her for another long shift, and she nodded before stepping into the cool night air. On her walk home, she replayed the day in her head, not the customers, not the orders, not the long hours, but the sound of the piano. Even the out-of-tune notes the child played stayed with her longer than they should have. She wondered why the piano affected her so strongly these days. Maybe it was because it had been so long since she touched one. Maybe she missed something she never admitted she missed. The next morning, before the diner opened, she returned to her usual routine. But unlike other days, she paused longer than usual at the piano. She pressed a single key softly this time. The sound was slightly sharper than she remembered, but still warm in its own way. She pressed another, then another. She stopped quickly when she heard the owner walking in from the back. But even in that short moment, those quick notes felt like tiny breaths of life she hadn't felt in a long time. She wondered if she should ask the owner about playing it sometime. But the thought made her nervous. What would she even say? She wasn't a performer. She hadn't played in years. And the piano wasn't there for entertainment. It was just decoration. So she remained silent and went back to wiping tables. Later that week, something else happened that made her heart stir again. A middle-aged man sat near the counter reading a newspaper, his coffee cup half empty. He looked tired, but his eyes softened when he glanced at the piano. At one point, he leaned toward the waitress when she came to refill his cup and asked casually, "Does anyone ever play that thing? Or is it just for show?" She smiled politely and said, "I think it's just decoration." He nodded. "Shame. Looks like it has stories in it." She didn't respond, but his words stayed with her longer than she expected. Stories in it. She had never thought of it that way, though something about that idea felt right. The piano did feel like it held stories, old, dusty ones that no one had bothered to open in a long time. As the week went on, she found herself lingering near the piano more often. Sometimes she dusted it carefully, even when it didn't need dusting. Sometimes she lifted the fallboard just a little, enough to peek at the keys, but not enough to attract attention. The keys were uneven in color, some bright white, others yellowed with age. But even like that, they looked familiar in a way nothing else in her life did anymore. The customers continued to pass by, unaware of the quiet storm building inside her. And she continued working, though her mind kept drifting back to a part of herself she thought she had locked away. One afternoon, during a particularly slow period, the diner felt unusually calm. Only 2 customers were seated in the entire place, and both seemed lost in their own thoughts. The cook was prepping ingredients in the back. The owner had stepped outside to make a call. The waitress wiped the counter, then the tables, then walked back toward the piano. Her heart beat faster, though she didn't quite know why. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the feeling that sometimes you have to do something before your courage slips away again. She sat down on the piano bench. Her hands hovered above. The keys. She didn't press anything yet. She just let her fingers float there, as if reconnecting with something her body still remembered, even though her mind didn't trust itself anymore. Slowly, she pressed one key. The sound echoed softly. Then she pressed another. This time, she tried something simple, a small pattern she remembered from years ago. Nothing complex, just a few notes repeating gently. The melody didn't come out clean. The piano was old, and some keys stuck slightly. But the sound, although imperfect, filled the quiet diner with a soft, humble music. She didn't play long. Maybe 20 seconds at most. But it was enough to send a warm wave through her chest, a feeling like coming home after being gone for too long. She didn't realize until she stopped that she had been holding her breath. When she heard the kitchen door open, she quickly stood up from the bench and pretended to straighten the napkins on a nearby table. Her face felt warm, almost embarrassed. She wasn't sure if anyone had heard her. She wasn't ready for anyone to know. Not yet, but something had changed. Something she couldn't undo, even if she tried. After that, she found excuses to be near the piano when the diner was quiet. She didn't dare play more than a few notes at a time, never enough for someone to notice. But those moments kept her going through long shifts. They made her smile softly to herself when she thought no one was looking. They reminded her of a part of her heart she had forgotten how to listen to. One night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling and wondered what she was supposed to do with this feeling. She wasn't a child anymore. Dreams didn't pay bills. Music didn't fill the fridge. And yet, she couldn't escape the truth. The piano made her feel alive in a way nothing else did. She fell asleep with a strange sense of longing, but also a quiet hope she didn't fully understand. The piano waited in the corner of the diner, and she was beginning to realize that maybe it wasn't just decoration. The rain had already started when she reached the diner that evening. It wasn't a heavy storm, just a steady, quiet drizzle that painted the sidewalks dark and made the lights from passing cars shimmer on the wet pavement. People hurried inside for warmth, shaking droplets from their coats and brushing water from their hair. The smell of damp jackets mixed with the smell of fresh soup and warm bread from the kitchen. It made the diner feel softer somehow, almost like a shelter where the outside world couldn't reach too deeply. She moved through the diner with her usual calm steps, taking orders, clearing tables, refilling glasses. But something about that night felt different even before anything happened. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the way people seemed more restless than usual. Or maybe it was the small weight she carried inside her chest. That quiet pull that had been growing ever since she touched the piano days ago. As she walked past the corner where the piano sat, she felt the familiar tug. She didn't stop, didn't touch it. She couldn't. The diner wasn't empty tonight. Groups of people were scattered across the booths, their voices rising and falling in waves. The piano had always felt like her secret, something fragile she couldn't let others see. She didn't want anyone watching her, not when she barely believed in herself, But tonight would not go the way she expected. The diner grew louder as the evening moved on. A group of office workers entered, their voices bright and tired at the same time. They had clearly come from a long day and wanted somewhere to relax, to talk, to vent about work. They took up 2 tables near each other, pushing menus aside and stretching their arms like they owned the place. They weren't unkind, but they were loud, and the energy around them filled the space so much that it changed the atmosphere immediately. She approached them with her notepad, wearing her gentle smile, the same one she always wore when she felt nervous. They barely looked up when she greeted them. Their conversations overlapped, spilling across the table like loose papers. She waited patiently until they noticed her, and when they finally did, they ordered quickly, not bothering to slow down. Some spoke at the same time. Some didn't even pause their discussions. She wrote everything down in neat handwriting, making sure not to miss anything. When she walked away, she wasn't upset. She was used to this. Being overlooked had become something she had quietly accepted, something that didn't shock her anymore. She tried not to take it personally. People had their own lives, their own worries. She was just someone carrying plates. But even so, there was something about the group's energy that left her feeling small. Maybe it was the way they didn't see her at all, as if she were part of the furniture, like the stools, the napkin holders, the piano in the corner. She brought their drinks, then their food. They didn't say thank you. They didn't make eye contact. They were so wrapped up in their own world that she felt like a shadow moving around them. At one point, as she placed a plate in front of a man, she stepped backward a little too quickly to avoid bumping into another customer. Her heel caught the edge of the rug, and she wobbled slightly. The plate stayed in her hand. Nothing spilled, nothing broke, but one of the office workers chuckled. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the sort of laugh someone gives when they don't think the other person will hear. She heard it anyway. She steadied herself and continued working. Her face remained calm, but a small sting warmed her chest. She tried to shake it away. She had work to do. The hours passed, and the diner slowly thinned out. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping on the windows with a steady rhythm. The office workers stayed longer than she expected. They were halfway into another round of stories when one of them pointed at the old piano in the corner. "Who put that thing here?" he asked with a laugh. "Looks like it hasn't been played since before any of us were born." The others turned to look. One of them joked, "Maybe the cook plays it to stay awake." Another said, "Someone should try it." "Anyone know how?" They looked around the diner as if expecting someone to step forward. No one did. Most customers had already left, and the few who remained were too busy eating quietly or staring outside. One of the office workers grinned. "Hey," he said, pointing toward the waitress as she passed by. "What about her? Maybe she can play something." She froze for the smallest moment, then forced a soft smile and shook her head politely. "I can't," she said, her voice quiet. "Oh, come on," another teased lightly. "Give us a tune. Make the place lively." She shook her head again, still gentle but firmer this time, and hurried away before they could continue. Her heart beat faster, not from fear of them, but from the thought of touching the piano with people watching. She couldn't imagine anything more frightening. As she turned the corner, the cook looked up from behind the kitchen window, sensing something was wrong. But she simply shook her head and gave him a small smile to reassure him. He went back to his work. The group continued talking, laughing, and teasing among themselves. For a moment, it seemed like the night would pass like any other. She would finish her shift, go home, and leave the piano untouched once again. But life has a strange way of nudging people forward when they least expect it. She carried a tray of used dishes toward the kitchen, weaving through the tables with her usual careful steps. The office workers were still laughing, still talking loudly, but she tried to block them out. Her mind drifted back to the melody she had played earlier that week, the one she had quietly tapped into the silence when no one was around. The piano had felt like a doorway then, a tiny crack opening into something she hadn't dared to explore. She wasn't thinking about the group. She wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the piano. And maybe that distraction was why she didn't see the chair leg. Sticking out from the side of the table got her foot caught. She stumbled forward. Tray in her hand wobbled dangerously, the plates clattering loudly. She managed to catch herself before she fell, but one plate slid off the tray and landed on the floor with a dull, embarrassing thud. It didn't break, thankfully, but the sound echoed through the quieted diner. The office workers turned immediately. One of them laughed. Not a loud, mean laugh, just a surprised one, almost like he found the moment mildly amusing. But the sound still hit her like a tiny sting. Her cheeks warmed. She bent down quickly, picked up the plate, and placed it back on the tray. She kept her head down, her hands steady, but inside, something felt heavy. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply carried the tray to the kitchen, feeling smaller with each step. The cook met her at the door, his eyes soft, but before he could say anything, she smiled again, too quickly, too politely, and said she was fine. He nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but he didn't push. She returned to the main floor, trying to pretend the moment didn't bother her. But she didn't approach the group again, unless she had to. She stayed busy with other tables, wiping surfaces that didn't need wiping, refilling cups that were already full. She tried to keep moving, thinking the movement would push the embarrassment away. The group eventually stepped outside for a moment to smoke and talk in the rain. Their absence left the diner oddly quiet, as if the air finally had space to breathe again. And that was when everything changed. She stood near the counter, holding a damp cloth in her hand, staring absent-mindedly at the piano. The rain outside tapped in a familiar rhythm. The lights reflected softly off the polished floor. The diner felt oddly empty without the loud voices. She didn't think. She just walked out. Her steps were slow at first, almost hesitant. Her breath felt tight in her chest. But something inside her moved forward before her doubts could pull her back. She reached the piano. Her hand hovered above the keys. Her heart thumped gently, not with fear, but with something she couldn't name. Something fragile, something grave. She sat down quietly on the bench. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment as she took a slow breath. The diner was nearly silent, except for the soft hum of the kitchen. She lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys. She pressed one. A soft note drifted across the quiet space. She pressed another, then another, forming a tiny pattern she remembered from childhood. The sound was imperfect, but it felt alive. She let her fingers move gently, almost shyly, picking up a simple melody she hadn't played in years. The diner seemed to hold its breath. She didn't think about who might hear. She didn't think about her past or her fears or the group that had laughed earlier. For the first time in a long time, she played because she wanted to. And in that small, fragile moment, the quiet corner of the diner came alive with music. She didn't know it yet, but the world around her was starting to shift. Her fingertips continued to move, each note breaking open something inside her she thought had closed forever, and right outside the diner doors. Just steps away, the office workers were about to walk back inside, completely unaware of what they were about to hear. The next morning arrived earlier than she hoped. The sun had barely risen, yet the sky already held a pale glow, as if the world was waking up slowly and gently. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. Her heart felt heavy as if something inside her was caught between hope and fear. The previous night replayed in her mind, every look from the guests, every whispered comment, every step she took back into the quiet kitchen after the piano moment ended. She didn't tell anyone what happened. Not her neighbor upstairs, who always asked her how work was going. Not the old woman who sold fruit on the corner and always asked for a smile. She kept the whole night inside her heart because she wasn't sure what it meant yet. She didn't know whether it was the beginning of something or just a moment that would come and go like everything else. She pushed the blanket off and sat up slowly, rubbing her face with both hands. It was her day off, but her body moved out of habit. She boiled water for tea. She opened the window to let in air. She tied her hair back, even though she had nowhere to be. That was the funny thing about long routines. They stayed with you, even when you didn't need them. Her small kitchen was still quiet when her phone buzzed on the counter. She frowned because no one really messaged her that early. When she picked it up, she saw a number she didn't know. Her thumb hovered over the screen for several seconds before she finally opened the text. Good morning. I was at the restaurant last night. The piano moment was something special. May I ask, do you play professionally? She blinked at the message, reading it twice. She didn't know who it was. Maybe another staff member? Maybe someone from the group? Maybe even someone who had filmed her, even though phones weren't supposed to be used there. She didn't know what to reply, so she simply put the phone down and walked away from it for the next hour. Her mind kept returning to the question, do you play professionally? The truth was simple no, she did not. She once dreamed of it. She once pictured herself in places filled with soft lights and quiet audiences, hands gliding over keys that felt alive. But life didn't follow her plans. Money got tight, responsibilities piled up, and dreams quietly moved to the back of her mind. After some time, curiosity forced her to check her phone again. Another message had arrived. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. I just wanted to say your playing stayed with me. I think you should do something with it. She felt her breath catch slightly. She didn't know how to take that. People rarely told her she should do things, unless it was something like bringing out more clean glasses or sweeping the back hallway. Hearing someone talk about her talent, about her potential, felt unreal. She typed back slowly, unsure if she even wanted to press send. Thank you. I'm not a professional. I just learned on my own. She hit send before she could change her mind. The reply came faster than she expected. You learned on your own? That makes it even more impressive. She didn't respond after that. Part of her wanted to. Another part wanted to run from it. The attention made her nervous. It felt too new and too fragile, like something that could disappear if she looked at it the wrong way. She set her phone aside again and tried to make breakfast. But every time she cracked an egg or picked up a piece of bread, her mind drifted away again. She kept seeing the restaurant guests staring with wide eyes. She kept hearing the sudden silence in the room after she pressed the last note. She kept feeling that strange trembling inside her chest, half fear, half excitement. She finally gave up on breakfast. She sat by the window with her cup of tea and watched the street outside. People walked past in coats and jackets, some rushing, some talking, some dragging small suitcases behind them. Everyone seemed to be moving toward something. But she sat there, still unsure where she was supposed to go next. Hours passed like this, slowly and quietly. Her phone didn't buzz again. She almost felt relieved. She didn't want a stranger to push her into anything. But at the same time, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he described her performance as something special. Later in the afternoon, she grabbed her jacket and walked outside. She needed air. She needed movement. She needed to stop thinking so deeply, because thinking too much always made her heart race in uncomfortable ways. The weather was cool, but not cold. The breeze brushed gently across her face as she walked toward the park near her building. It was a place she visited often on her days off. There were benches facing a small lake, tall trees that offered shade, and a path that circled around. The whole area. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. She walked for a long while, listening to the sounds of children laughing in the distance and the soft crunch of leaves under her shoes. When she finally sat down, she let her shoulders drop. For the first time all day, she felt her body relax. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard footsteps approaching. She assumed someone was just passing by, so she didn't look up. But the footsteps slowed and then stopped near her bench. She finally lifted her head and froze. It was the man who had invited her to play the piano the night before. The same. One who had spoken to her with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. The same one who had stood closest to the piano as she played. He looked different in the daylight, less formal, more human somehow. He was holding a paper cup of coffee, and he gave her a small smile when their eyes met. "I thought that was you," he said softly. "I didn't mean to surprise you." She opened her mouth, but no words came out for a moment. She didn't expect to see him. Not here, not today, not so casually standing in the park, as if they already knew each other. Finally, she managed. "How did you know I come here?" "I didn't," he said, shaking his head. "I walk through here sometimes. I wasn't sure it was really you until I got closer." She wasn't sure what to say. She looked back toward the lake. He didn't sit without asking. "May I?" he asked, motioning to the other side of the bench. She hesitated and nodded. He sat down with a gentle sigh, as if the air around them was fragile. For a moment, they both stared at the lake in silence. Then he spoke again. "Last night? You?" "Surprised everyone. I hope you know that." She swallowed. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "It wasn't trouble," he said quickly. "It was the best part of the night." She didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments were something she wasn't used to. She felt her chest tighten again, not in fear this time, but in something warmer. He took a sip of his coffee and continued, "I don't know your story, but I could see how much you feel the music. It's rare." She looked down at her hands resting on her lap. They looked so ordinary. You wouldn't look at them and think they carried years of practice, years of quiet moments in front of an old keyboard she bought second-hand. But he had noticed something others, DIDN single quotes T. Finally, she asked, "Why did you ask me to play last night?" He smiled in a slow, thoughtful way. "I wish I had a complicated answer, but honestly, I was curious, and I sensed something in the way you looked at the piano. Some people glance, some people stare, but you looked like you missed it." She felt her breath catch lightly. She didn't expect him to see that. She didn't even know she had looked at the piano long enough for anyone to notice. He leaned forward slightly. "I wasn't wrong, was I?" She shook her head slowly. "No." He nodded, as if he already knew. Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like both of them were thinking carefully about what to say next. Then he spoke again, more gently. "Do you still play? Outside of last night, I mean?" "A little," she said honestly. "At home, when I have time. Do you enjoy it?" She nodded. "Very much." "Then why did you stop before?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She took a deep breath, looking out at the water again. "Life," she said finally. "Things changed. Money got tight. And dreams don't survive well when life gets messy." He didn't say anything right away. He let her words sit in the air between them. After a moment, he responded with a quiet voice. "Some dreams survive anyway. They just wait for you to come back." She felt something inside her shift. She didn't know what to call it. Hope was too big a word, but it was something close. He stood up then, adjusting his coat. I don't want to keep you, but if you ever want someone to hear you play again, I'd be honored. She looked up at him, surprised again. Why? Because talent like yours shouldn't stay hidden, he said simply. And because you seemed happier last night than at any other moment I saw you. With that, he gave her a soft nod and began to walk away. She watched him until he disappeared behind the trees. For a long time after he left, she sat on the bench, without moving. The lake remained calm, the air quiet, the world gentle. But something inside her began to stir something she thought she had lost long ago. And she knew, deep down, that her life had already begun to shift in ways she couldn't fully understand yet, but she was ready to find out. She woke earlier than usual the next day, even though she didn't have to. Her eyes opened before the alarm could ring, and she lay there for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the city outside her window. Something felt different inside her, like a quiet energy she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement exactly, and it wasn't fear either. It was something in between, something careful and fragile, but warm. She rolled out of bed slowly, feeling the cool air on her arms as she moved across the apartment. She boiled water, opened the curtains, and made tea. Everything felt familiar, but she didn't feel as heavy as she did on most mornings. The memory of the man's words from the day before kept echoing in her mind. Some dreams survive anyway. They just wait for you to come back. She kept hearing it, even when she tried not to. She didn't know if he said it because he believed it or because he wanted her to believe it. But it had stayed with her, deeper than she expected. She sat at her small table with her tea, letting her eyes wander to the corner of the room where her old keyboard sat. She hadn't touched it in days. Not because she didn't want to, but because sometimes the longing hurt more than the silence. But today felt different. Today, the keyboard didn't look like a painful reminder of what she lost. It looked like something she could return to, even if slowly. She finished her tea, stood up, and walked toward it. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a moment. She pressed one key gently. The sound was soft, a little uneven because the instrument was old, but it filled the room in a way nothing else did. Another note followed, then another. Soon her hands were moving, not perfectly, but with a sense of ease she had forgotten. She didn't play anything complicated, just small pieces she used to love. Simple melodies that lived in her memory like old friends. As she played, something eased inside her, as if every key released a little tension she had been carrying for years. After a while, she sat back and took a deep breath. She felt lighter. Not fixed, not suddenly confident, but lighter. The rest of the morning drifted by quietly until her phone buzzed on the counter. She wiped her hands on her jeans and walked over to check it. The number was the same as before, the same unknown one from yesterday, but this time she felt less nervous about opening it. Good morning. I hope you're having a peaceful day. I wanted to ask, would you ever consider playing in front of people again? Nothing big, just something small. She stared at the message, her heart fluttering unexpectedly. She read it twice before she sat down. She typed slowly. I'm not sure. It has been a long time. He replied almost right away. I understand. There's no pressure at all. I was just curious. She took her time before answering again. Maybe one day. I don't know. His next message made her smile without meaning to. One day is good enough. She put her phone down, but her thoughts didn't settle. A part of her wanted to say no firmly, to protect herself from expectations. Another part of her felt something opening, something she wasn't ready to define. She didn't know why he cared so much, but his messages felt genuine, not forceful. Around noon, she headed out for groceries. The walk gave her space to think. She passed the familiar shops, the bus stop, the bakery she liked but could rarely afford. The day felt ordinary, but her mind wasn't. Halfway to the store, she found herself pausing outside a music shop she used to visit just to look at instruments she knew she couldn't buy. She hadn't come this way in months, maybe longer. The same old piano stood in the window, polished and perfect. She felt the same familiar pull toward it. The man inside the shop noticed her hesitating and stepped out with a friendly smile. "It's been a while since I saw you out here," he said softly. Felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't think you'd remember." "I remember people who love music," he said with a small shrug. "You always stood here like the piano was calling you." She laughed under her breath. "Maybe it was, but I don't have the money for things like that." He nodded thoughtfully. "Music doesn't care about money. It only cares about being played." She didn't know what to say to that. The world rarely gave such simple truths. "Want to come inside?" he asked. No pressure. "Just look around." She hesitated, but the moment she stepped through the door, she felt something warm, almost familiar. Instruments lined the walls, the faint scent of wood and polish filling the space. She walked toward a small upright piano in the corner. It was cheaper than the one in the window, but still out of her reach. The shop owner leaned against a shelf. "Try it if you want." She looked at him uncertainly. "Are you sure?" "Of course. Music shouldn't be behind glass." She sat slowly, running her fingers across the smooth keys. They felt so much better than the ones on her beat-up keyboard at home. She pressed a key. The sound was warm and full. She played a few soft notes, then a few more. Soon she lost herself again in a melody she hadn't played in years. The shop owner didn't interrupt. He just listened quietly. When she finally stopped, she felt a strange mixture of joy and sadness. "I wish I could afford it," she said quietly. He nodded. "I know." She stood up, thanked him, and left before her emotions got too strong. But she promised herself she would return, even if only to play for a few minutes. The walk to the store felt different after that. She moved slowly, thinking about the way her fingers danced across the keys. She couldn't remember the last time she felt that connected to something. When she got home later, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "I walked past the restaurant today. Everyone is still talking about your performance." She blinked at the screen. "They're talking about me?" "Yes, in a good way." A strange tightness filled her chest. She didn't know why people cared. She didn't understand what they saw. She replied cautiously. "What are they saying?" "That they can't believe you work there. That they didn't know someone like you could be standing right next to them and go unnoticed." Her breath caught slightly. She didn't know how to take that. It was both flattering and a reminder of how invisible she often felt. "I'm not special," she typed back. His reply came quickly. "That's where you're wrong." She set the phone down. She didn't know how to argue with him, and she didn't know how to accept it either. The rest of the evening passed quietly. She cooked dinner, cleaned up, listened to the faint noise of cars outside. But her mind kept drifting to the piano shop, to the man's messages, to last night at the restaurant. When she finally sat down at her keyboard again, she played with more courage than before. She played longer, too, letting herself feel everything she had ignored for years, her old dreams, her old passion, her old self that she had pushed aside. Late that night, as she lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling and let her thoughts settle. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel small or unnoticed. She didn't feel like someone whose life was already decided. She felt something new, something she couldn't name yet. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was possibility. Maybe it was the beginning of a change she didn't even know she needed. Whatever it was, it followed her into sleep like a soft whisper. The next morning she returned to work, unsure how things would feel after everything that happened. When she walked through the restaurant doors, a few staff members looked at her differently, curious, surprised, maybe even impressed. But no one said anything directly. They all returned to their jobs quickly. For a moment, she wondered if she imagined the whole thing. But then the manager approached her with a small smile. "Good to see you," he said. Everyone heard what happened. She stiffened slightly. "Is that a bad thing?" "Not at all," he said gently. Some of the guests left comments. Good ones. It made the night more special. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. Throughout the day, things felt a little lighter, a little easier. People weren't ignoring her the way they used to. They didn't suddenly treat her like someone important, but they didn't look past her either. It was small, but she felt the difference. During her break, she stepped into the back hallway for some quiet. That's when her phone buzzed again. "Are you free tomorrow?" The message said, "I have something I want to show you." She stared at the message, her heart beating a little faster. She hesitated before typing back. "What is it?" "You'll see. Something I think you'll like." She bit her lip. She didn't want surprises, but she didn't want to say no either. "Okay," she finally wrote. His reply came instantly. "I'll pick you up at noon." She stared at that message the longest. No one had picked her up for anything in years. She didn't know if she was ready. She didn't know what this man wanted or why he cared so much about her music. But deep inside, something told her to trust this. Not blindly, not foolishly, but gently. She slipped her phone back into her pocket. For the rest of the shift, her heart beat a little differently faster. Warmer, more uncertain, but alive. She didn't know it yet. But tomorrow would show her something she had forgotten she even deserved. And part of her was finally ready to see it. The next morning arrived with a soft, pale light that slipped through her curtains, like a gentle reminder that today would be different from all the days before it. She woke long before her alarm again, not because of worry this time, but because something inside her refused to stay still. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was something deeper, something that felt like a quiet pull from the world, urging her to move, to step forward. She lay there for a few moments, listening to her own breathing, letting her thoughts settle the way dust settles in a quiet room. Today, he was supposed to pick her up at noon to show her something. He didn't say what it was. She didn't ask. She simply agreed, something she normally wouldn't do. She stood up, stretched her arms, and went through her morning like she always did. Boiling water, washing her face, brushing her hair. But everything felt slightly different, like the world around her had turned up its brightness by just a tiny bit. Even her small apartment seemed a little warmer, a little kinder. Every so often, she found herself glancing at the clock, watching the hours move closer to noon. She didn't pick out anything fancy to wear. She didn't have much anyway, but she chose a clean, simple outfit that made her feel comfortable. She tied her hair back loosely, looked at herself in the mirror, and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. A version of herself who didn't look tired or invisible. When the clock finally reached 11:58, she heard a gentle knock at her door. Her heart raced suddenly, a surprising wave of nerves rushing through her. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and opened it. He stood there with a small, warm smile, nothing too big, nothing too formal. He wasn't dressed like someone going to a meeting or a party. He looked relaxed, approachable. He greeted her softly. "Ready?" She nodded. "I think so." They walked down the hallway together, descending the stairs into the cool afternoon air. His car wasn't fancy or shiny, just a normal car that had clearly been well cared for. He opened the passenger door for her, not in a showy way, but simply out of quiet politeness. She thanked him and climbed in as he drove. The city faded slightly behind them. They passed familiar streets at first, but soon the buildings grew smaller and the streets wider. She watched through the window, wondering where he was taking her, wondering why her heart felt so tight in her chest. After a while, he said softly, "I hope you slept well." She nodded. "Yes, better than usual." "That's good," he replied, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. They drove in silence for a while longer, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It felt peaceful calm. She didn't feel pressured to talk, and he didn't seem bothered by the quiet. He simply let the drive speak for itself. Eventually, the car turned into a neighborhood she had never been to before. The houses were spaced apart, each with wide lawns and tall trees. The road curved softly until they finally pulled up to a small building that sat behind a row of old trees. It didn't look like a house or a shop. It looked like something in between simple and quiet, with big windows that allowed sunlight to pour inside. He parked the car and turned to her. "We're here." She looked at the building, then back at him. "What is this place?" "You'll see," he said, stepping out of the car. She followed him inside. The moment the door opened, a familiar scent filled the airwood, polish, the faintest trace of something warm and musical. She froze in the doorway when she saw what was inside. Pianos, not expensive or decorative ones, just real instruments lined up neatly. Uprights, grands, older ones, newer ones. It looked like a small studio, or maybe a space someone used to teach or practice. The room was bright with sunlight, as if every beam of light wanted to fall on the instruments. She stepped in slowly. Her breath caught halfway in her chest. He watched her reaction carefully, not saying anything for several moments. Then he explained gently, "This place belongs to a friend of mine. He lets people come here to practice sometimes. I thought maybe you'd want to see it." Her eyes softened, though she couldn't stop the tremble in her voice. "You brought me here for me to play?" He nodded. "Only if you want to. Nothing else." She looked around the room again, her heart almost aching. "Why would you do that?" He took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because when you played the other night, it wasn't just talent. It was something more. You played like someone who had once loved music with their whole heart, even if they had to step away from it. I don't want you to feel like your gift has to stay hidden in your small apartment. Not if it brings you peace. Not if it brings you happiness." She felt something warm rise in her chest, a mix of gratitude, confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. He nodded toward the grand piano near the corner, the one closest to the big window. "That one has a beautiful sound. If you feel comfortable, you can try it." She walked toward it slowly, like someone approaching something sacred. Her fingers brushed against the polished surface. She lifted the lid, placed her hands above the keys, and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she began to play. The first notes filled the room like soft light. They flowed out of her gently at first, and with more confidence as the melody grew familiar beneath her touch. Her hands moved slowly, then faster, then with a kind of quiet strength she had forgotten she possessed. He sat on a chair nearby, not too close, not too far, just listening, not judging, not analyzing, simply listening as if the music itself was enough. She played for a long time, longer than she intended. Piece after piece, memory after memory. Every note felt like a step back into a life she had abandoned but never truly forgotten. When she finally stopped, her chest rose and fell with deep breaths. She looked up at him, expecting him to look impressed, or surprised, or maybe proud. But instead, he looked calm almost peaceful. That, he said softly, is someone who should never stop playing. She felt her eyes sting suddenly. She blinked hard, trying to keep herself composed. I don't know if I can do anything with it. He leaned forward slightly. You don't have to become anything big. You don't owe the world a performance. You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. But you deserve to have this. You deserve to feel this alive. She looked down at her hands, the same hands she used at the restaurant, the same hands she used to carry plates, scrub tables, tie aprons. Now they looked different. They looked like the hands of someone who still had something left inside. You really believe that? She asked. He nodded without hesitation. Yes, I do. She swallowed, her voice low. I don't know where to start. You already started, he said with a gentle smile. You started the moment you said yes to being here. They stayed in that quiet room for another hour. She played some more. Sometimes she stopped just to talk. He asked her questions, not about fame or ambition, but about how music made her feel, what it meant to her, what she remembered from her childhood. He was patient with her silences, kind with his words. When they finally stepped outside again, the sun was beginning to set. The sky carried long streaks of soft orange and pink. She looked at the colors quietly, feeling something in her chest shift and settle in a new place. He drove her home slowly, neither of them talking much. When they reached her building, she hesitated before getting out. Thank you, she said softly. I don't know how to say it properly, but thank you. You don't have to say anything more, he replied gently. Just promise me something. She looked at him. What? Promise me you won't bury your music again. She took a breath, feeling every part of the moment settle inside her. I promise, she whispered. He nodded, and she stepped out of the car. She watched him drive away, a small part of her wishing she could bottle the feeling he had given her hope, possibility, dignity. That night, she sat at her own keyboard again. Even though it was old and its sound was uneven, she didn't feel ashamed of it. She didn't feel like someone living a life that didn't belong to her. She felt like someone who had finally remembered a part of herself that she had been forced to forget. She played until late, her fingers moving with a quiet confidence. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Days passed, then weeks. She returned to the practice studio several times, each visit making her feel a little lighter. She started learning new songs again, pushing her fingers to move in ways they once knew. Her confidence grew not loudly, not boldly, but quietly. Like something blooming in the shade dot, the guests at the restaurant still talked about her performance from that night. But she no longer felt like she needed their approval. She didn't need applause or big stages. She only needed one thing, to play. One evening, after a long shift, she walked home feeling tired but content. When she entered her apartment, she paused, looking at her keyboard. This time, she didn't hesitate. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and let her music fill the room once again. Her life hadn't transformed into something glamorous. She didn't suddenly become famous or wealthy. But something far more important had changed. She rediscovered herself. And sometimes she realized that was the greatest gift life could ever give.